Hi, and welcome to With Chanakya. In today's video, we'll be learning how you can containerize a Node.js and Express REST API using Docker. Let's get started. In today's video, we'll be talking about containers, what is Docker. We'll also learn how to create a Dockerfile for a Node.js app. We'll also learn how to build that Dockerfile into a container image and then run that container from that image. We'll also make some changes to a previous API that we built in one of our other tutorials, and we'll make sure that it can serve some images, HTML files, and others. And finally, we'll test this whole thing once we're done building it. As always, all of the code and other artifacts from this tutorial will be available on my GitHub repositories. So before we get started, what exactly is a container? So a container is defined as a lightweight package for software that contains your application code, it contains your runtime, and any dependencies or libraries that that application is using. So taking an example of like Node.js, the container consists of the Node.js runtime, it consists of your application code, and it consists of any other dependencies that you have. So in case of REST API, dependencies like Express and others that you install into your application are all packaged into that container. So how did we get here? So essentially, applications were deployed on physical servers, hardware boxes that were located in data centers. Since that was very inefficient, virtualization came in where they were dividing these physical hardware infrastructure into virtual machines. So a virtual machine was kind of a combination of starting off with sharing the infrastructure, and you would have a host OS. And on top of this host OS, you would have something called as a hypervisor. And this is essentially what would help in terms of creating these virtual machines or managing these virtual machines. And each virtual machine that you have on top of that host OS and hypervisor would have its own operating system called as the guest OS. And on top of that, you would have the dependencies of the application, so any libraries, binaries that have to be run along with that application, and then you would have your application as well. While virtual machines are great and they're still very commonly used all across IT infrastructure, they're very heavy and cumbersome. So when you're trying to build applications that need to scale quickly, run up, run down, or scale up, scale down very quickly, they can take a while to kind of boot up all that size that they have, because they have their own operating system and they have a tremendous amount of space and memory that they take up. So some of the advantages of containers include kind of being able to deploy a lightweight software package. We're also talking about build once, run anywhere, because containers are now being supported across multiple platforms and operating systems. And they're super lightweight, which means that you can quickly boot them up. You can scale from one microservice or one container all the way up to 100 within a matter of seconds. So a container is slightly different. You still have your host infrastructure, you have your host OS, but instead of a hypervisor, you have a container daemon. So in our case, that would be something like Docker. So Docker would be managing all the containers that we're building and running on the host OS. And each container would have its dependencies, as I mentioned, the runtime, and then the application itself. So much more lightweight. So now, when we talk about containers, one of the words that's quite synonymous with containers is Docker. So Docker is an open source project which now became an enterprise company that really popularized Docker or containers with developers. So containers have been around even before Docker with programs like Linux containers, LXC, and others since 2008. Docker launched in 2013, so containers have been there. But Docker really made containers available to everybody. And they really made it easy for everybody to be able to create, build, and then actually run those container images. So there's other examples like Postman and LXC. These are all great examples of containers. And there's other orchestration engines like Kubernetes and others that help in terms of orchestrating or managing these containers that you're trying to run. For today, we'll be talking about how you can actually build a container image for a Node.js REST API using Docker. Before we get started, if you like content like this and you're looking for more tech tutorials, please do like this video, subscribe to the channel, and make sure to hit that bell icon so that you get notified of future videos that I release. let's go ahead and get into the code. All right, so let's go ahead and get started here. The first step for us is to clone a previous repository that I created in one of my earlier tutorials. That tutorial was to create a REST API using Node.js and Express, and I'll have that link in the description below so that you can follow along for that as well. In this particular tutorial, we're going to take that Node.js and Express REST API and we're going to containerize it using Docker. So the first step is to head over to GitHub. My link on GitHub is /cliocum13. I'll also have the repository link in the description as well. So I'll go over to repositories. Let's find the Node.js API tutorial. And I'm going to copy the HTTPS link so that I can clone this over to my desktop. So I'm going to go ahead and say git clone and then paste that URL there. And then that'll be cloned. So now we have the Node.js API tutorial repository on my machine. I'm going to go ahead and navigate into that directory. And a couple of things here. It's a Node.js project, so we already have a package.json. There's a couple of dependencies over here. So let's go ahead and install those so that we can actually run this project. The next step for us is I've already defined a start script in the package.json file as well. And I'm using Node1 to run this particular program or this application. So we can simply say npm start, and it'll start our API. And this is a dog API, so it has two routes. It essentially is retrieving and responding with the dog data that we have within our API. So within our source folder, you can see we have a simple app.js file, which is creating an Express server. And within that, we're serving some routes, which are defined within our router. And within the router, we have two routes here. One to get all of the dogs that are there in this array, and one is to be able to get one of the dogs based on the name if it's found within the array. So now that we have this, we can actually go over to Postman as well, and we can quickly test it out. So we'll go ahead and click on that, and we'll say localhost 9900/dogs. So we're trying to retrieve all of the dogs. And there you go. We're getting all of the dog data here. And just to show that it actually works, we can go back here and I'll add a fourth dog for you as well. So we'll go ahead and call this hello. And we'll say that the breed is a German Shepherd. Perfect. So I'm running that. Node1 lets me restart the server once again without having to do anything. And we can come here to /dogs, click send. You can see it's sending all four. One mistake, I should have corrected the ID. Not a big deal. Let's change that. And then we send it again. We have all of the details here. We can also search for specific dogs. So we'll go ahead and say /dog. And then we'll say hello and send that. And you can see it retrieves the details of the dog. So perfect. Now that we have our API code up and running on your machine, the next step for us will be to get into actually Dockerizing this. So to be able to do that, we're going to have Docker Desktop installed. In my case, I'm using a Mac, so I have Docker Desktop already installed. I'll have the installation guide and the download link in the description below so that you can use that. So we'll just go ahead, open up another terminal window here, and just to showcase that I have Docker installed, I can do docker -- version, and you can see that I have Docker on my machine. The next step for us is going to be to create a Dockerfile and then use that Dockerfile to actually be able to build an image of our application. The first step to containerizing this application is creating the Dockerfile. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll say touch Dockerfile. And as you can see within our root directory of the application, we have a new file, which is the Dockerfile. And within this, we have to define what our container image should be like. So we're building a container image and we're defining what it should be like. So we're going to go ahead. The first step for us is going to select what our base image should be. You can take an Ubuntu image or any Linux flavor image and do it. But I'm going to take one of the official Node.js pre-installed images that we have as the base image here. It'll have Node.js already installed on it, and it's going to be using Alpine, which is a lightweight version of it. So we'll go ahead and say from, and we'll say node : and then we can give a version number, and then we'll call it Alpine. The next step for us is going to be defining where we want our Dockerfile, once we're building the image, where do we actually want the operations to start from? So kind of like creating a new directory, right? So we're going to say workdir, which is a work directory, and it basically says, give me a path. So we're going to say /user/source/app. The next step for us is going to be copy the package.json file that we have within our app repository here and bring it into the container. The reason why we're copying only the package.json file first and not the actual source code is because when container images are built, they're built using a layers concept. And if we first do the dependency install on our container and then add the source code, that way whenever the source code changes but the dependencies don't, the build process for the Docker images is just a lot faster. So let's go ahead and say copy, and we're going to say package. I'm going to say star.json because we want the package lock.json also. So all of those files to be copied into our working directory. The next step for us is to actually install the dependencies. We're not going to copy the dependencies from our source code because we want those to be installed fresh when we're building the Docker container. So we're going to go ahead and say run, and then the command, obviously, as we know, is npm install. The next step is going to be copy over all the source code that we have into the Docker container as well. So we're going to go ahead and say copy everything that is here into the container, into our working directory, which is source/app. Now in this case, there are some files that we don't really want to be copied, like node modules. I have an images folder here, which is part of the tutorial that I don't want to be copied. Obviously, the README really is not needed. So things like that. So to do that, we can actually create a Docker ignore file, very similar to git ignore file. So we're going to go ahead and say touch Docker ignore. Then we're going to go ahead and open that, and we're going to name all of those folders and files that we don't want. So we're going to go ahead and say node modules, images, and readme.md. We want Docker to ignore those files. So even when we're copying everything, we're not going to touch, or Docker is not going to touch any of those files. So now that we've copied all the files, one of the things that's important from a networking standpoint is exposing the port that we have our application running within the container, which is 9900, as you remember. So we're going to say expose 9900, which is our port. And then the last step is to actually run the project. So we're going to say command, and we can give it the command here. Basically, each argument of this array is part of that command, and we're going to say npm start. So brilliant. Now that we have our Dockerfile running, it's going to basically take a base image, which is a Node.js Alpine base image, create a working directory, copy the package.json files, run npm install to install the dependencies, copy all of the source code, expose the specific port that we need, and then run the project. So you see we have the runtime, we have all of the dependencies, and we have the source code. That's exactly what we defined as a Docker container. Let's go ahead and now build our container image using this Dockerfile. The way we're going to do that is we're going to use the Docker build command. So we're going to say Docker build. We want to build from this particular directory. So we're going to just say dot. And then -t is basically to tag this particular image. So we're going to say clocum13, which is my username. And then we're going to give it a name, which is dog API. And then I'll give it a version. I'm going to call it 0.1. And then we'll go ahead and build this image. And it's essentially running all parts of that Docker file. So you can see it's first pulling the base image, the Node.js base image. And once it's pulled that, created the working directory, it's copying the package.json and then running the npm install for all of our dependencies. And then it actually has the command, which is going to be run at the time when we actually run this particular Docker image. So if you can actually go to Docker images now, you'll actually be able to see that a new image was created 14 seconds ago. This is our container image. So now if we want to run this image, we can go ahead and say Docker run. We have to map the port. So our port that we exposed within the container is 9900. We have to map that to the host port on my machine. Let's say 8080 for this. And I'm going to map that. And then the next step is for us to give the actual name of the API. So clocum13/dog API colon 0.1. So this is going to run the image that we have locally of that particular container that we just built. Let's go ahead and run that. You can include -d as well, and that'll run it in daemon mode, which means that it'll run in the background. That's usually what you would do when you would run a Docker container, but since this is a demo, I'm making sure that I'm running it here. One more thing is that I'm running nodemon within the container. That's also not recommended when you're running it in production. This is just a demo tutorial, so that should be fine for now. Now that we have this, we can actually go back to Postman, and now we can actually hit the image or the container that's running on my machine right now. And it's not at 9900, it's actually at 8080. That's the port. So we can go ahead, hit the absolute same API. Let's change the name so that you see a different result here. And we'll go ahead and say send, and you can see we're getting the result. Now I'm going to go ahead here and let's go ahead and stop this particular server so that you don't think that the old one is running. It's only the Docker container that's running. Let's go back and let's say Mika, and we should get a Husky here. Perfect. So our Docker container is up and running, and we now have a Node.js API containerized. The last step, a little bit of a additional here for this tutorial. Let's add some static content as well. So it's not just a simple REST API that gives us JSON data. Let's add a bit of a static content as well to Express so that we can actually host like an HTML page with some images through our Docker container. Express has a really easy middleware that allows us to serve static content within our code. So we're going to use that in order to actually serve this content. So the first step that we're going to do is let's go ahead and use Control-C, and let's actually end our Docker run there. We're going to come back to our project, and the first thing that we're going to do is within our source folder, we're going to go ahead and create a new directory. We'll call it public, and let's go into that public folder. We're going to do two things here. One, we're going to create an index.html file, and the second thing that we're going to do is we're going to create another directory called images. So one of the things that we're going to do is I'm just going to have a simple HTML page. I'm not going to go ahead and cover the actual HTML that I have within this page. Let me just go ahead and add some HTML here. Basically, we have some custom fonts from Google, very simple. Then we have a quick heading saying Happy the Golden Retriever. And then we have an image of Happy as well over here. So let's go ahead and add that image into our images folder, which is defined over here. So let me pull that image up. And then we'll go ahead and add this image into that folder there. It's actually in the wrong folder. So let's go ahead and put it into images. Yes, that's where we want it. And then boom, we have a quick and simple HTML file that is static content. And we want to serve this content using Express. So the easiest way to do that is we're going to go over to our app.js file. And what we can do here is we can actually go ahead and say app.use, because we want to use an Express middleware. And we'll say express.static. And then we're actually going to use the path module here. So let's go ahead and import that. So we're going to say constant path equal to require path. We don't have, let's go ahead and do that. And then once we have that, we can actually go ahead and say path.join. And then the first argument that we're going to give to this is the current directory. And then we're going to follow that with public. So basically we're saying to Express that everything within the public folder, go ahead and you can use that as static content. So that's what we're defining here with Express. So let's go ahead and actually try this out. Let's see if this actually works for us. So we're going to go ahead and say npm start. We're doing all this locally, nothing to do with Docker. So we have the server up. Let's go over to quickly to our browser here, and we'll say localhost colon 9900 and see what happens. Perfect. So you can now see Express is actually serving static content. So this is a HTML page that it's serving. We can create routes as well. So if we wanted this to come at /happy, very simple to do. You would just do a send file method within your routes, and it's easy as that. Now the next step for us is to rebuild our Docker container image because it does not have what we want here, and make sure that this works as well. One change that we're going to have to do is go to Docker ignore. We're going to have to remove images here because it's not going to recognize the images folder. We're going to have to remove that. So we want images to be added as well within our new Docker build. Other than that, we don't have to make any changes at all. Let's go back here. Let's say Docker build. I'm going to use the autocomplete, but I'm going to name this as .2. That's our version, and go ahead and build it. And you can see it's significantly faster because nothing changed in the package.json, nothing changed in the dependencies. The only thing that changed was the code. So it copied that code changes that were there and quickly built the image. So that's a big advantage for us. We're going to go ahead and now do Docker run, and we're going to run the exact same command. The difference is we're going to run a new image. And you can see we have the server up and running. It's actually, that's wrong. It's saying 9900 because that's static that I defined there. But now we have that up and running. We're going to come here. The port that we defined in our Docker container was 8080. So we're going to go ahead and pull that up. We can say /dogs. We get the dogs result. We'll remove the dogs here. And there you go. We have static content coming from your Docker container. Brilliant. So in this quick tutorial, you have learned how to actually use Node.js and Express and Docker together to create a containerized REST API and actually be able to serve static content and dynamic content from it. Thank you for watching this tutorial. If you'd like more content like this, click the like button on the video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell icon to get notifications about new videos that I release. Thanks for watching.